panel of papers in this conference. And let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Vardit Rispler-Chaim. I'm from the University of Haifa in Israel, and working on Islamic medical ethics for about the last 20 years. Don't try to guess my age. I started very young. Okay. We have five presenters in this panel. I'll have to be very strict with the time. Each presenter will have 15 minutes, and the questions will have to wait until everyone has delivered their paper. Then we have.
Does that count? I get any sympathy points for that? It's on the corner there.
So our first speaker is Omar Sultan Haque. He has currently received his Doctor of Medicine degree in Harvard Medical School in the medical ethics track. He is also a doctoral candidate in contemporary religious thought at Brown University, and his academic interests span medicine and religious practices, and he has published several articles in both areas. Please.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to be talking about, essentially, the title of my talk is related to how might we want to think differently about the notion of personhood in light of neuroscientific advances. And because the time is short, I'm going to get right to it. And there's a few problems that have come up across the times of this conference that have been mentioned, one of which is a vast majority of transplantations coming from living donors rather than non-living donors. And so I set this up as a background point that I won't go into, but just to mention the full potential of life-saving procedures not being adequately met across the world, especially in certain countries with majority Muslim populations. And there's, in the literature, there's somewhat of a hint that Muslims might be somewhat reluctant to embrace the idea of brain death. And so when scholars look to the Quran and the Hadiths, unfortunately, there hasn't been any explicit guidance on these issues. And so classical descriptions tend to be more along the lines of respecting the sovereignty of Allah, separating the soul or the nafs or the ruh, variously defined from the body. And the classical descriptions tend to have the experiential signs of death, such as glazing of the eyes, stopping of the breath, parting of the lips, relaxation of the feet, these kinds of signs of when life might have ended. So kind of intuitive folk physiological concepts kind of projected to the person watched. And to give a quick summary, the modern idea, developed in 1968, really it's defined as irreversible cessation of the function of the entire brain. But as human mastery and control over the nature and environment extended beneath the skin into the depths of the sinews of human physiology, advances in medicine established that the non-naive notion of organs as functionally modular and able to be mimicked, replaced, and enhanced by human agency came to the fore behind this definition. This is followed from the vitalist controversy of the 19th century, where the distinction between inorganic and organic matter is prominent, and clear distinction between life and death is problematized. So this is to set the backdrop a little bit. So nowadays it's very common to hear and think about, failure of a heart is really nothing other than the failure of a very exquisite pump. And some contemporary proposals on the problem of brain death in Islam have come after 1968. Most countries pretty much took up this definition. And yet a lot of scholars mention a prevalent disconnect between popular religious sentiment and scientific practice still. So we'll get into a little bit more about why that might be the case. And Shia scholars have actually accepted this idea of brain death long before Sunni scholars. They have the oldest organ transplantation program in the world in Iran, in the Muslim world in Iran, from 1964. And Khomeini actually allowed organ transplantations from brain-dead patients during his life, but this never really came to fruition since then. In the Sunni world, it's a little more complicated because there's been a number of conferences from the OIC and the Muslim World League, and these statements have tended to be somewhat conflicting since the mid-'80s. Oftentimes constructed to appeal dueling sentiments between physicians and theologians, or those who would be interested in the cardiopulmonary versus the brain definitions of death. My consensus is that these kind of off-quoted statements really only reinscribe the more conciliatory manner of the conference, in the sense that they kind of reinscribe the confusion inherent in these things. So there has not really been a lot of clarity on these issues in the last 20 years. And it seems from my reading that they rather mask these underlying tensions that I'll explore. So it's, in my opinion, the distinctive nature of these salvific acts of respiration and transplants that bring them to the fore of our theological minds. Everything from fluorination of water to sterilizing surgical equipment surely saves lives, but these acts force our gaze and attention to every painful effect of human agency over the world, and they really expose a fundamental, long-standing theological tension in the tradition between divine and human agency, predestination, things like this. In the context of the human species, applying and advancing its capacity to manipulate and control every aspect of the natural world, including especially itself, to say let God maintain his autonomy or let nature take its course, increasingly becomes a way of deciding by not deciding, of making decisions by pious abstinence, a conflicted manner of using human ingenuity to build and control, and then when the consequences of one's raw agency against that God are more obvious, unconsciously one abdicates agency at the end to protect oneself from what has been done all the while. And this, to me, seems rather unhelpful, to come to the end of life and exhort in a normative manner for humans not to interfere in God's agency to take away life when he wills, and all the while to have been consciously and deliberately manipulating that very date seems somewhat disingenuous. And I set this up as the backdrop of the discussion. It seems to me that the real tension here is based not on whether one can simply follow principles, but knowing when such principles apply, knowing whether one has adequate and consistent knowledge of the idea of irreversibility of death, and sentience, and the proportional effects of one's autonomy on health outcomes. And these tensions really come to the fore when we think of the PVS, the persistent vegetative state, and the anencephalic babies, who some give birth while they're brain dead, technically, some do all kinds of things, yet the question of whether they're alive is prominent. Now, getting to I'd like to present a notion of personhood as embodied consciousness. And so the backdrop for this is that in the Islamic traditions, the overwhelming position on personhood is this intuitive and intractable one of substance dualism, meaning that there's a physical body and somehow there is this immaterial essence of a person that's incorporeal, enduring, and indivisible. Even Rushd, who denied the possibility of afterlife, still held on to this Hellenic privileging of this ethereal displacement of the intellect. So it's a very prominent position in the tradition. So the Islamic scholarly debate has tended to avoid the crucial question of life and death because they threaten traditional notions about personhood. Where non-living organ transplantation has been permitted, it has been made permissible under the principle that the needs of the living outweigh those of the dead, and saving the life of a person outweighs the prohibition against bodily mutilation of the dead. Yet, it is not whether, as a society, we can make exceptions to traditional dogma every now and again for casuistically derived pragmatic or expedient or utilitarian social benefit, and then without even asking what such decisions may require or demand as larger theological import. Pragmatic acts are still acts and necessarily change the way we understand the world around us. It's my contention that this radical ontological shift that's inherent in these progressive rulings on brain death forces us to give up the traditional notion of personhood that we have inherited for many reasons. One, it seems no longer scientifically valid, and I would like to argue it's also unethical. To change one's notion of what constitutes death necessarily changes one's notion of what it means to be alive and to be human. Acknowledging that when one dies, it is the physical structure of the brain that somehow changes, admits that the soul is embodied in the physical brain and has its properties dependent on its physical neurophysiological functioning. And if there's one lesson from the history of science, is that most of our intuitive, obvious, common sense folk intuitions of the world are plainly wrong. That we're the center of the world, the Earth, that this table is mostly solid, that the natural state of objects is at rest. All kinds of things are wrong, proved wrong. And similarly, I would argue that this immaterial, non-corporeal, permanent, and stable notion of the self is also misplaced based on what we know about how the brain works. And principally for this reason. All the qualities classically attributed to the ethereal soul, personality, decision-making, volition, emotion, feelings, memories, rationality, dreaming, are actually manifested and can be manipulated by action on a contingent and fragile physical process, i.e. the brain. The self is contingent rather than necessary. The self is not inevitable, unified, and permanent, but changes all the time and is malleable to human intervention. The true vehicle of the soul is in the organization of information, complex, cooperative, layered, parallel distributed processing of multiple and interconnected labeled lines of information. On this integrative view of the self, we must say that the soul is what the brain does, rather than what the brain isn't. The self develops over time from infancy to adulthood. Memory, personality, as well as mental illnesses all have genetic and determinative environmental influences. Molecular mechanisms that partially explain adult phenotypes are able to be manipulated quite easily with drug and pharmacological interventions. We can prevent the further development of a self by simply inhibiting new memory formation. The self is clearly divisible in experiments where they cut the corpus callosum, and you have essentially two selves in one body. The self degenerates slowly with Alzheimer's disease. In hemispatial neglect and the parietal lobe lesions, you can have one self with half a body attended to. So there's all kinds of permutations that this view of life gives. It's as if the experience was different from the brain electrical activity. Only the brain, quote, only the brain has become a dirty few words. The term "my brain" should be seen for the contradiction it certainly implies. All internal feelings, visions, experiences are embodied. In reality, saying that all aspects of our inner lives necessarily involve our brains is quite unremarkable. We have to ask, where else did our inner world originate? Now I'm going to make 5 points about implications of this view for Islamic bioethics and Islamic theology. The first two are obvious, scientific evidence that I think leads credence to these views. And the second is the ethical issue of redistribution of organs. The third would be on the idea of dignity, which is a prominent issue in end and beginning of life. In the traditional Islamic account, the dignity and values are some things that are derived and derivative from a relationship and a covenant with God, with humans as a Khalifa. They're not inherent in the human person. They are subject to the decree of God. Humans are vice regents on earth, and this is one of the reasons we see a profound ambiguity in the whole Islamic human rights discussions, because many of the Islamic ideas of Islamic human rights actually connote contingent obligation or duty to God rather than rights or entitlements of the human qua human. And this is unremarkable for most who have read this literature. But what I'd like to argue is that we find the same concepts of dignity more strongly grounded in this view of personhood, because their derivation is from a notion of personhood that is not predicated on a doubtful dualistic notion of the self. Second is the idea of sanctity, or hurma. As has been made clear by a number of reformist and feminist thinkers, it's questionable whether the traditional conception of the human is even capable of upholding its own attempted ideals. Bodily integrity and personal human sanctity are variously applied to persons based on their group membership and therefore their ontological moral status within and outside the Islamic community. Every human being in the moral community has hardly been thought of or treated as interchangeable in terms of their rights and obligations. Take, for example, a woman slave who's a homosexual. It's a tough call. With the traditional notion of personhood, bodies should be treated more ethically and less indiscriminately without the traditional notion of personhood, because sanctity and dignity are inherent to the human person, qua person, not derivative or dependent on gender, group belonging, or religious belief. Humans must be accorded sanctity and dignity by virtue of the species-specific accomplishment of consciousness, as the most important attribute of Homo sapiens that deserves moral status. as well as the idea of incipience, which, if you've been following the President's Council, it's a big notion. Now, this accomplishment of consciousness I would define as having awareness, self-reflection, ability for a continuous narrative of personal identity, symbolic thought, feeling, meaningful communication and expression, responsibility for one's choices, and the ability to pursue personal projects. So something you would find on a gradation ontogenically and phylogenetically. Islam does not have an explicit doctrine of the fallen nature of the human of the world, yet it retains significant elements of its original Platonic dualism by virtue of positing another more pleasurable heaven world and an unconstrained, non-dependent, non-material God, ontologically separate and beyond this world as its creator. The human person is thus understood as a part of nature in this new view, as its creation and most cognitively developed product, not of ontologically separate status, separate and unique in kind, but only by degree. The rest of nature must no longer be thought of as not ontologically separate to the ultimate source of our being and a means for mere human ends of mastery and domination. But to the extent that they exhibit a capacity for consciousness, symbolic thought, reflective action, the ability to feel pain, other parts of nature are accorded proportionally similar amounts of sanctity and dignity. Classical scholars identified life with the movement of the body, and this may be why they identified sleep as similar to death. A lot of similar narratives about when you sleep, your soul goes away, comes back. But this seems to be patently false by what we know about how the brain functions at night during sleep. Sleeping brain activity is often indistinguishable from being awake. Sleep is not when the soul separates the body, but when it must be most fully present. Memory consolidation is incredibly important at this time. What I'm proposing is we should now identify life and the existence of personhood with some variety of intact cortical activation. Death should thus be thought of the loss of personhood, an analog to the chronic description of separating the ruh from the body. Brain death should not be thought of as a kind of a form of death, which makes one wonder how dead is dead enough when these are thought of as stages. The basic criteria for brain death have been met. It's not that death is approaching or imminent, but has already occurred. Other than the brain, doctors have been able to mimic or replace almost every other organ in the body while keeping the person intact. Death is the end of essential brain function, and the end of essential brain function is death. And finally, a comment on the idea of ensoulment, conception. The notion of the ruh as consciousness also solves the contradiction of traditional conceptions of ensoulment. Traditionally, it's understood that God breathes his ruh into the body at 120 days, but it's also clear that the heart begins to beat well before 4 months. If we think of this new view, we admit that there's no definitive point when the ruh emerges. Rather, it blossoms gradually and in consonance with the slow and methodological pruning and wiring of the nascent fetal nervous system. A long and fragile project of becoming, even at birth, where the person having already performed the greatest miracle of its lifetime is not yet fully formed. And this is the entire point. Personhood is an emergent property of the nervous system dependent on increasing phylogenetic and ontogenetic complexity and information processing slowly grown but easily lost. In conclusion, all religious traditions appearing late in the project of the Homo sapiens evolution and in varying circumstances across the planet have responded to this mystery and have come to the world with concepts and categories of knowledge that were available to them. We have no reason and we have no regard to hold a 9th century human jurist responsible for having an understanding of the brain only appreciated in its full import in the last 2 or 3 decades. Nonetheless, this is a basic premise of our inquiry, and this may be where this comfort comes from listening to this. Islamic legal structure should be based on the most accurate and established idea of the human person, even if this seems to contradict tradition. Law as well as religion must evolve to meet the needs of the societies it hopes to regulate and inspire without apology or contradiction. Otherwise, as Emery Lakatos and Alistair McIntyre have shown, it slowly fails to solve problems adequately and continues a decline of influence and its condemnation of itself as untrue or worse, irrelevant. I hope that this humanistic, naturalistic, non-dualistic notion of embodied nature of personhood that I have given will give us opportunity to rethink through a number of Islamic bioethical issues. And with personhood as human consciousness, I present it as something strange and delicate, it remaining as all the times that we do on this planet, quite mysterious but vulnerable, intricate yet precarious, gradually born yet easily extinguished, bright but brief. Seems to me that there's never been another definition of the soul.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Omar, Sultan Haque. And the next paper will be presented by two writers, Iqbal Jaffa and Shabbir Alibhai. Iqbal Jaffa is currently a resident physician at King's College, the University of Queensland, Australia. His research focuses on gastroenterology and pediatric care. Mr. Jaffer graduated with honors in a BA degree in religious studies with a minor in psychology at McMaster University. His undergraduate thesis is titled Comparative Religious Medical Ethics Between Orthodox Judaism and Shia Islam, a discussion of the permissibility of organ donation, palliative care, and autopsy. Shabbir Alibhai. Dr. Alibhai is an assistant professor at the Department of Medicine and Health Policy, Management and Evaluation, the University of Toronto. He received his master's and MD degrees at the University of Toronto and has written extensively on religious ethics and end-of-life care. Please, who is presenting?
I am.
Both of you, or
No.
only you?
What we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of an entertainment kind of session. He's going to teleprompt me from over there, and I'm just going to stand here and talk. It's going to be more of a ventriloquist act, actually.
Okay, sounds good. Please.
Move this way. Okay. First of all, let me state that my credentials are overstated. I'm just in medical school. I'm not a resident anywhere. Not yet, anyway, unless somebody's hiring. And it doesn't work. Okay. So just to briefly go over the outline, we're going to start with the methodology, go a little bit of medical background. I'm sorry. And then go through all those steps. What I want to focus on is the steps that are, the pieces that are missing from the paper rather than the pieces that are in the paper. I'm hoping that you've all read it, and then we can talk about it that way. So for methodology, it was an interview-based format with insider experts, two rabbis, one an expert in bioethics, and one an actual Orthodox Jewish judge who actually rules on these sorts of things on a regular basis, and a Shia imam who is actually quite well respected within North America and abroad, and is quite well versed in the opinions of Shia mujtahids and bioethics. And then obviously follow up with textual sources just to see that they weren't lying to me. Medical background. What's important? First, I took 65 pages and put them into 27. So there's a lot that's missing. So most of what is important in decision making as far as both Judaism and Islam are concerned is with respect to the details. So therefore, as a broad statement, organ donation is permissible, but it has to be clarified where the organ comes from, who it's going to, when it'll be taken, blah, 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 blah. And this is apparent with every topic that you can come up with within biomedical ethics. So therefore, it's imperative to understand and appreciate the intricacies within medicine itself before passing judgment on certain issues. So how does this procedure work? Exactly. Tell me what you're doing exactly. And that's what the judges, that's what the jurists, that's what they want to know. They can say organ donation. Okay, that doesn't mean anything to me. You doctors explain it to me, and then I have problems with this point, and this point. Other than that, everything's okay. Or not okay. Sorry. Go away. Okay. In Judaism, sectarianism is unlike other religions. I'm skipping a lot in terms of principles and sources of law and whatnot because Michael Gordon covered it yesterday, and he's way more entertaining than I am, so I hope you got it out of that. But just a recap, sectarianism is unlike in other religions. Sects do not differ in their interpretation of the law, rather they differ in the understanding of the nature of the law. So the Orthodox sect considers the law to be authoritative and as a way to conduct oneself. And the Reform considers the law to be important in as much as it helps one to lead a good life. So there's a spectrum, and as Americans can understand, red to blue. It kind of works like that. So you can have varying shades in the middle. And so you can have someone who's orthodox, but be very, very red. Or you can have someone who's orthodox be kind of purple. And you can have someone who's conservative be red or purple or blue, and then reform is blue. So I'm sure you can understand it in that way. So the law interpreters in Orthodox Judaism it's based on a system of meritocracy. Similar to the system in Sunni Islam, people know who's who in Orthodox Jewish law. They know who's the best. And if you ask somebody, they'll be able to either tell you somebody who knows who's who, or they'll tell you who's who. As was mentioned yesterday, once you have an opinion, you're stuck with it. You can't keep asking around until you hear what you want, which is the same as, when you're kids, you try to ask mom, and then mom says no, you try to ask dad, and then they defer back, and no. You just ask one parent, and you're stuck. But what happens is that there's a box analogy that's used, and it's if you get a decision on a law from, say, one Orthodox rabbi, another Orthodox rabbi might rule differently from what that first one ruled on. However, with respect to a certain law, it'll all fit within a little box. So if you say, is the transplanting of a pig's liver into a human being allowed? And one rabbi will say, based on this and this law from this and this book, I say yes. And the other one will say, based on the same this and this and this and this, I say no. But that fits within this box. They won't say, based on another thing over here and another thing over there, I say yes as well. It won't happen like that. It'll be very confined as to where they get what they want, where they get the information from, and then confine it to a little box. Which is the same in Islam, where similar hadith, similar Quranic ayats are consulted, but you get different results. They all fit within the box. Some distinctions to be made. The word treifa comes up in the paper, which means torn. Basically, it's a war metaphor. And someone who has been deemed to be medically incurable and who will die within a span of 12 months. Now, how do you decide somebody's going to die within 12 months? I don't know. Maybe I'll learn in the next 4 years. But right now, it's up to the doctor, who's the consulting physician. And if in doubt, they can ask somebody else. What this status allows someone is to forego medical care, forego heroic intervention. As well, it allows them to embark upon intervention which is not well tested, not well documented, and may have a very low chance of survival. So if a procedure has a 10% chance of survival, then as a normal person who might require this intervention, you wouldn't be able to undertake it. As a treifa, you would, because if you're torn, you're going to die anyway. So if it shortens your life, then it's not that big a deal, if you're a treifa. If you're not, then you can't. And then goses is someone who's in the process of dying, and someone whose death will be imminent within 72 hours. So if you watched the movie yesterday, and the second opinion that the man got was, you have 24 hours to live, that man would be a goses. Within Shia Islam, the law interpreters that I used are Ayatollah Sistani and Ayatollah Khui. And I say that it's more conservative and more permissive, but they're very inappropriate distinctions, because if we come back to the idea of the box, they use the same text, the same law, but within their own ijtihad, they come up with a different opinion. So, and also there's a lot more mujtahids, each of whom may have their own different perspective on the same issue. And so what happens is that you choose between them as a personal choice. And like in Orthodox Judaism, once you pick one, you're stuck with him until either you or he die. And so, see, what can happen with these sorts of things is that you can have differences within families or communities, and it's important to recognize what the patient follows. So if a patient says that, I'm Shia Ithna Ashari Jafri, and I follow Ayatollah Sistani, then you have one set of distinctions, one set of options. But if he says, I'm Shia Ithna Ashari Jafri, and I follow Ayatollah Fadlullah, or Ayatollah Khui, or Ayatollah Khomeini, or Ayatollah Khamenei, then you have a whole new set. And when it comes to, again, it's based on their ijtihad. And the problem is, decision making. So what do you have to do? You have to stick with the best interest kind of approach. And so the importance of knowing how people's religions feel with respect to certain issues is only one half the story. It's also important to know what the patient feels as well. So because of the broad spectrum of practice, which is what we've been talking about the whole time, there's no such thing as Islamic bioethics. There's no such thing. What is Islam? What is a Muslim? Not every patient feels as adamant about what their religion says as one might assume. So within Orthodox Judaism, you have that color gradient. There's way too many colors to try and make something like that for Islam. You may have a green, you may have a pink, you may have a yellow, whatever. There's just so many options and ways that people bring their own cultural context, their own ideological context, their own physical, where they find themselves context, into how they decide what is appropriate and what is not appropriate for them. So the need to clarify is huge. Right. And so back to this original point where you may know what the Shia school says. You may know everything about it. But if you don't know which mujtahid the patient follows, you have to figure it out. So, sorry, 5 minutes. I'm almost done. Summary. So if we go back to the paper, I just want to summarize basically the overall points. Organ donation or transplantation. In Orthodox Judaism, it's permissible. In Shia Islam, it's permissible. Withdrawal of intervention is not permissible. Same thing. Withholding intervention is permissible. Autopsy is not permissible. Notice the stars. Yes, everybody notice the stars? Stars usually mean one thing. Denotes case-specific nature of the decision. So, permissible. Yes, but. Permissible. Yes, but. So, Ayatollah Khoury allows organ donation from a person who has died. Ayatollah Sistani says no. That's desecration of the dead. However, what he writes on his website is one thing. What we hear from the grapevine is that he's kind of changing that idea. So as technology progresses, as information from science and medicine progresses, their understandings of things change as well. So, and it's a start. Withdrawal of intervention in Orthodox Judaism is not permissible unless you're a gosses. Then you're just wasting your time. Withdrawal of intervention in Shia Islam is not permissible unless you're finished. You don't live anymore, and they withdraw. I mean, if the idea of choosing brain death from one mujtahid is, if brain death becomes permissible from one mujtahid, then, it is permissible. But on another one, it's not. Withholding, if you're a treifa, yes, it is permissible. Similar sort of idea. However, if you have the chance to live, if you get intervention, then it's not permissible to withhold. An autopsy is not permissible. However, if it saves the life of another Jew or another Muslim, as it were, then it is permissible. If the coroner demands one, then it is permissible. It's very, very case specific, and this is what we need to realize. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Iqbal. Thank you very much, Shabbir. We really were enjoying the entertainment and enlightening comments. And we are now ready for the last paper in this panel, which will be presented by Debra Budiani and Othman Shibly. Dr. Budiani is a visiting scholar at the Center of Bioethics, University of Pennsylvania. She received her PhD in anthropology from Michigan State University and is particularly interested in the politics, economy of health, and issues concerning health and human rights in Northeast Africa and the Middle East. Dr. Shibly Othman is a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Periodontology at the State University of New York in Buffalo. Although his work focuses largely on dental health, Dr. Shibly has also a baccalaureate degree in Arabic and Islamic studies with a focus on Islamic ethics from Damascus University, Syria. During his tenure as an assistant professor, Dr. Shibly has supervised and mentored over 30 visiting scholars and international graduate students in dental studies. Please.
Good afternoon. And like many of us have told you, Jonathan, wherever you are, thank you so much for organizing this excellent conference. And thank you so much to all of the presenters who have stimulated so much thought and many lessons for me in thinking about many of the issues of Islam and bioethics. And thank you also for those of you who stayed around this long to join us for this final session. Othman and I will do a few, as a few other co-presenters have done, a tag team a bit today in our discussion on Islam, organ transplants, and organ trafficking in the Muslim world. We heard earlier yesterday morning that it's been said that transplants are the most intensely social of medical practices. I'd like to add to that organ donors are also arguably the most exploited, and that is living organ donors, are arguably the most exploited and then abandoned of medical resources in the social process of transplants. In response to Jonathan's suggestion that we state why we approach this subject as we have, I would like to background a little bit of how I got into this issue that's not mentioned in the paper. And that is during my research that began in 1999 on health concerns of Sudanese and Somali asylum seekers in urban Egypt. Of the approximately 500 asylum seekers I've talked to over the years, 100% of them shared a fear of organ theft while in exile in Egypt or seeking asylum in Egypt. So that started my further seeking of understanding the global phenomenon of organs trafficking and how transplants and especially donorship worked in Egypt and the region. So the transplant tourism has been said to be the largest practice of illicit organs harvesting concerning the active traffic in kidneys, primarily kidneys, although increasingly corneas from living donors and partial livers. From desperate living donors to desperate recipients who are willing to travel great distances to receive an organ for purchase rather than wait for their chance on a waiting list or inconvenience a related potential donor. One organization has identified some of the hot spots on the global stage of organs trafficking. As you can see, I won't get into this too much, but there's a lot to be said that's missing from this map about the Middle East and the way the Middle East is situated in this phenomenon. So some of the identified problems are race, class, and gender inequities in harvesting and distribution of tissues and organs. The circulation of organs follows the modern routes of capital from south to north, third world to first world, from poor to rich, black and brown to white. And a lot of this comes from various research, some of it is explicitly from Organ Watch research. This is what has been reported by various scholars to be some of the going prices of a kidney from a living donor. I personally have watched the price drop dramatically in the years I've been following this in Egypt, and it's between $2,000 and $3,000 now. In my last visit a few months ago, it has dropped as low as $2,000, depending on the ability of donors to know how to negotiate with brokers for that better price. Donors meaning organ sellers or kidney sellers. Characteristics of transplants in the Middle East. Shaheen's study suggests several. There's a lack of planning for organ procurement and transplant centers. There's a lack of effective health insurance. In the Middle East, residents of the Gulf states have for many years traveled to India, the Philippines, and to Eastern Europe to purchase kidneys made scarce locally. And I'd also like to say that the Middle East is also a resource for others, whether it be North Americans going to Istanbul for kidneys, but largely from Moldovans. So there's importance and lots of dimensions of the trade of why the Middle East is important. Some of the other things that are not on this slide that Shaheen suggests is that many patients consider a paid living non-related donor an easy way out of their problem, and physicians encourage commercial transplantation and gain from the continuing debates on the validity and legality of organ donation and transplantation. These debates in some countries have been going on for decades now without resolution. So there's a real trend to be passive on this issue. And then there's a lack of trust of minorities in the health system, as I observed from the refugee population. This is due largely to inaccessibility of the health system and lack of social justice for many minorities. I'll speak a little bit more about Egypt, the place that I know best. In Egypt, I'm not sure if this part was clear from Shireen Hamdi's paper, that it's illegal to procure from the non-living. I think she did state that quite clearly in what was read, and in addition to what was written in the paper. But so it's illegal to procure organs from the quote-unquote non-living, whether it be brainstem dead or non-beating hearts donors. But otherwise, in absence of established laws on brainstem death and organ transplants are handled entirely by the doctor syndicate, so they issue the license for the transplants. What my research has suggested is, after talking with several hundred Egyptian doctors, is that they estimate that many now say at least 90%, and I've recently got a hold of some quantitative data sets that I'm still analyzing, but that 90% of the donors are said to be non-related, so they're solicited for an organ sale. In Egypt, the laboratories are largely the brokers. Recipients and donors meet. They usually are engaged in that negotiation process with the brokers. And donors receive, like I said earlier, anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000. I unfortunately don't have the pictures. I told the story of Suhaila in the paper, and the picture's not here, but and it conceals her identity, but demonstrates her donorship in the image. Largely, what I found in Egypt is that kidney sellers or vendors keep their act a secret from their inner social circles. And so the lonely emotional load they carry is a consequence of their donorship. They are largely people who are largely in debt and have debts to pay, or are aiming to pay for their own or a sister's, in many cases, sister's wedding, because primarily from my quantitative data set that I recently obtained suggests that they're somewhere between the age of 22 and 30 and predominantly male, and their parents who are trying to feed their children and school their children and provide for their children more generally. I'll now give it to Othman, who will talk about some Islamic perspectives. Oh, I'm sorry, before I do that, I just listed here a few international efforts to abolish organs trafficking.
First, I would like to greet you with the greeting of love, greeting of peace, greeting of Islam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace be with you all. Islamic perspectives, first of all, this is my little studies in from Islamic perspective, Sunni school of thoughts. I don't claim to give you the Islamic perspective. You know, there is diverse, as you know, opinions on this issue. However, I will just give you a few points about the issue of organ donation from the studies that I did. This I did when I was invited to speak on Organ Donation Society in Buffalo, New York. So what I like to address this issue, as you all are familiar, it was discussed from the basic, is it allowed? Yes, it is allowed. Some school of thoughts, they said yes. More Islamic scholars, they said yes. However, some school of thoughts, they said no. As you know, like yesterday, Al-Sharawi, when we heard that, he said no because of protection of the body. However, there was no address of this particular issue from the basic of Maqasid al-Sharia that was illustrated in Al-Shatibi work, but this even goes back to the days one of Islam when it started. So, for example, this verse of Quran talks about who you believe be upright, for Allah bears of witness with justice, and let not hatred of people incite you not to act equitably, and equitably that is nearer to piety, and be careful of your duty to Allah. So first, in terms of social justice, in Allah yamur bil adli, the universal justice issue. Secondly, equality of humanity. And this Prophet Muhammad said that people are equal like the how do you go back? Yeah, but So I don't have to go back. So anyway, like the comb that we, comb our hair. So the comb, as you see, is all equal. There is no one teeth of this comb longer or fatter. So human beings are equal. For that reason, the Quranic teaching then emphasize, this is the studies based on goals of Sharia, maqasid al-Sharia in Islam. Goals of Sharia is that human rights, to the extent they supersede God's rights if they come into conflict. And this was mentioned by Al-Shatibi, mentioned by Imam Al-Ghazali when they discussed, this like 10 centuries ago, when they discussed sin with God and sin with fellow human beings. Also, maintenance of universal social justice for all mankind supersede having faith. As well, this was presented by all the people who talks about maqasid al-Sharia in Islam. For that reason, that there is, as you know, people who study maqasid Sharia, they talk about universal social justice, respect of human rights, preservation and protection of life, and freedom of choice. Not only for Muslim, I want to emphasize this, because people, they understand from Muslim nation being Muslim people, this is wrong. This is one opinion, I'm sorry. But my understanding of Muslim Ummah being Muslim and non-Muslims, based on also Quranic teaching, which include Jews, Christians that lived in the Islamic State. So, based on maqasid al-Sharia then, if we need to say that organ donation allowed, it is allowed under these conditions that recipients of the organs should be granted equal access to donated organs regardless of their race, religion. So not only Muslim allowed to get from Muslim, Muslim can give to non-Muslim as well, to Christian, to Jews, and probably one of the fatwa you are also familiar with, Dr. Firdat, is about the Faisal Mawlawi from Lebanon, who said when Palestinian child was hit by Israeli soldier in the occupied Palestinian territories, and he was like brain death. They needed their organ for a Jewish child in the hospital, and the Islamic fatwa came, yes, it is allowed. So whether it is Muslims or not Muslim. So this is the issue, is that equal accessibility to donated organs regardless of race, religion, identity, and class, or financial situation. Because based on Islamic goals of Sharia, we should not have privileged community and unprivileged community where people need to sell their organs for the rich people who can afford it. Otherwise, we created social injustice that goes along against the spirit of Islamic teaching. And this will exploit the poor. And for that reason, my recommendation then, we have to look at this issue and other issues from the context of Islamic maqasid al-Sharia. So I would recommend to review the principles of maqasid Sharia, reviving the Madani community that was established by the Prophet Muhammad at the time of Medina and Munawwara, which called to equality between all people, and also selling one's organ for financial pressure is not, as scholars, Muslim scholars said, that he is committing sin. It is the community who committed sin that make him sell his organs for needs. And that goes back to Omar ibn Khattab when people stole, they want to be punished, but Omar said no, because it was the year of hunger. Amr Ramada, when people, they were hungry, so they stopped Islamic law at that point because there is a need. So it is then the problem of the people in the community, not this person.
It was the sobering stories and of donors that I won't have time to tell today, but I do tell one story in the paper, like I mentioned, that gave birth to an organization we call the Coalition for Organ Failure Solutions. And I'm sorry I didn't put the website up, but it's www.transplantsmiddleeast.org. And the vision we have is a world of ethical solutions for organ failure patients and their donors. And our mission is that we aim to, one, encourage state accountability for establishing solutions to the problem of organs trafficking. Two, support movements to secure alternative solutions for patients in need of organs and not leave that part of the transplant equation out. Three, and what's closest to me and my motivations is work with local human rights and other activists and outreach groups to provide assistance and outreach to individuals who have already been solicited for organ donorship. Assistance like clinical services, long-term, employment assistance, as studies have indicated that employment opportunities and alternative income generation methods are compromised after a kidney donation, especially in the developing world. Legal services and emotional support. As I've observed the tremendous anxiety of especially very young donors go through this process, one of my assistants said, let us be the friends you never told, as I mentioned, as so many of them keep this their organ sale such a secret from their social circles. And finally, to provide outreach to potential donors. We've seen the ulama increasingly involved in public health movements, and I'm not sure if it's increasingly, but in an exciting way in movements like the HIV fight. And we'd also desire the ulama's partnership along with other key stakeholders, other ethicists, the state, human rights activist groups, especially donors and recipients, laboratories, and others who have a stake in this. And so the questions we'd like to end with asking is how do we revive the principles of Maqasid al-Sharia that protect vulnerable individuals and require social justice to work towards solutions to organs trafficking, especially as we've seen many countries in the region be so idle for a long period of time. And then also something I'd like to mention is, as we've seen many fatwa talk about the haram nature of exchange of money between donors and recipients, so the sale, and rather than via altruistic donation through altruistic means. So given the haram label that is frequently placed on organ vendors for resorting to an organ sale, how do we work against such approaches that blame victims of the organs trade? And then finally, just from a programming perspective, I'd love to get feedback on the question, how do we assure that outreach such as health service provision does not also work to foster the trade by providing social services not otherwise offered to a marginalized population? And we'll end there, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Debra and Othman. If I may just add one comment about the prices that you quoted, I'm afraid they're going to drop even more. I've heard that there is a center in China for transplant, and it is located within a center of about 7 prisons around. So straight from the execution of a person sentenced to death, the organs would be transferred, and I want to be at least hopeful that they don't plan the execution according to the patient in need in the hospital. But I've known about some Israelis that have gone there because they wanted to shorten the line of waiting for organs. I think we'll open now for questions. Yes.
Will you sit down?
I will sit and will invite the speakers.
Sit in the middle. You sit in the middle. Yeah.
Careful.
I thought I got to keep that.
Okay, Abdul Hakim Bishawi, Library Manager from Harvard Medical School, Dubai Center. Thanks for the excellent presentations. I have I'd like to let you know that I'm doing an internship in Boston, and when I arrived, I attended a talk for one postgrad student who's traveled to the Lebanon, Middle East, and she came with a stat about abortion and the opinion of the Islamic schools about abortion, allowed or not allowed, all of that. And I made it clear. I commented about what she said, and despite of the different opinions of the Islamic schools, but still we have 1 or 2 references, which is the Quran Kareem and the Sunnah by Prophet Muhammad, peace upon him. That despite of these things, our reference is these 2 things. So what I noticed now that there are different opinions, allowed or not allowed, for one of the talks here. The other thing, just to share with you some experience, I know somebody in the United Arab Emirates. She's American from Washington. She worked there and she converted to Islam. And before she converted, she started asking about these questions. Why this Islamic laws say that X about this topic. However, if you go to Y, to the other school, you have a different answer. What's your, well, like, she asked me, how to do, what's the difference between these? To whom shall I refer to? So I hope if somebody can make it clear that we have to return back to the Islamic, the Quran Kareem and Sunnah. Thank you.
Me or you? Is it a comment?
Well, just a brief remark regarding this Gossès. We already talked about Gossès yesterday. Well, I think you're absolutely right in what you have said about it, but the problem is with these ancient or these very old and respectable categories that they are difficult to understand in a contemporary medical setting. Just to illustrate, a few months ago, we published in Journal of Clinical Oncology with an international group of experts a consensus paper on guidelines regarding prognostication in advanced cancer. And it's very clear from our review of the literature that it's nearly impossible with any degree of certainty to make sure that even to be sure that even a person will die in 24 or 48 hours. So these are beautiful and clear-cut distinctions, but in medical practice they are extremely difficult and dangerous to use them. But because when you're using them, you could end up in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, you know, and that's something that should be avoided too.
My name's James France. I'm an undergraduate studying science and neuroscience here at Penn State. And I have a question specifically for Dr. Haque. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. But I was wondering what your position was on research on humans, perhaps regarding stem cells for organ generation, but also perhaps on living individuals, specifically with regard to your opinion on the sanctity of life, but also the individual's autonomy and participating in perhaps sacrilege upon one's their own body.
Yeah, I guess, you know, for consistency, I guess, you know, if I really think about it, I'd say that the idea of, you know, it's not a Muslim concept, but in the Judeo-Christian tradition of ensoulment happening at conception seems clearly absurd to any scientist, because, you know, 3/4 of conceptuses are not aborted, but are just, you know, they leave the body unnaturally. So, you know, you can have one conceptus that becomes two twins. Is that two souls or one? You can have two conceptuses come together for a chimera. Is that two souls or one? I mean, so I would draw the line along the lines that I argued for. Essentially, you can think of a clone as any cell in your body can be the progenitor of a clone. So the way I think about it is it's like having two identical twins at different times, and in that sense, the embodiment of human consciousness and what makes people distinctive is clearly not just what's in their genes. So if I would object to identical twins, I would also object to reproductive cloning. Now, these are the theoretical issues, but there are, of course, safety issues and all those other things that probably make it impossible.
Awesome, Padel. I have questions for Mr. Haque. I don't think you graduated yet, right? So
No.
maybe last year, right? I have a question that kind of led to the talk that I was given by Iqbal of what makes Islamic, in the sort of sense that, in my mind, if you have a framework within which to have ethical deliberation, that's what we call an Islamic framework. If you were to change the terms and put the outside framework and just change the terms to make it into your understanding of something, perhaps it loses that sense of Islamicness because it's not an ethical framework as seen by Islam or an Islamic framework. So by saying consciousness means ruh, and that contemporary classical scholars don't really know what's going on. I'm questioning whether the framework that you're positing is maybe progressive, maybe new, but no longer is the Islamic ethical framework. And that leads into the second, and so I'm just going to say the both things at the same time. So Iqbal, for example, had a different take on in his talk, where he was talking about many things being permissible and not permissible in the Shia school, or the various schools. Something you mentioned, and it was mentioned yesterday as well, about, I guess you were getting at taqlid, about the fact that perhaps if you say that I follow this imam, or this mujtahid, in the terms that you used, I am bound to follow that mujtahid. And I question that, because as perhaps we said, we're making joking of fatwa hunting, people fatwa shop. And whether that's impermissible or permissible, the whole point of a fatwa is that's non-binding. It's the legal opinion. And in the end, you are responsible for your deeds, to my understanding. Hence, whether you do that or not, it doesn't make it impermissible if the people don't like it. And also mentioned in the Jewish talk, and I've done some preliminary work about the fact that, well, you can only get one opinion, you can't get a second one. However, clinically, I've seen people get second ones, and I've also read of cases of people get second ones. So how can you say it doesn't occur?
You first or me first? You go first.
I think yours is more interesting. It's a good question. It's one I expected, but I'd say, to answer your question in a dismissive manner would be to assume that the constant refrain we hear, it's not, Islam isn't a thing and this and that, but more specifically, every religion begins as a heresy, even Islam, against a certain community in which it's formed. And there's, if you think of religions as historical processes, and if you think of them as understanding how they originated and why they originated and what they're responding to and the needs of the community and the leaders that developed them, then there's, I think, absolutely nothing heretical about the fact of injecting new knowledge into a tradition. I mean, maybe you could think of it as Reform Judaism. These are people who began with Moses Maimonides in a certain time and responded to a particular post-Enlightenment framework, and there's a lot of things that aren't very pleasant in that either, but people who are more inclined towards that view followed it. And I think also it changes the terms of the debate, because Islam has tended to be at least since the 12th century kind of somewhat streamlined in its orthodoxy. So these things change all the time. Who knows? There's many definitions of a community.
Okay, when it comes to the issue of taqlid, it differs from the Sunni kind of perspective. And in Shiism, the issue of taqlid is that once you decide upon a particular mujtahid, you're bound to that mujtahid. And that's within the doctrine of taqlid, because the mujtahid is the representative of the imam of the time. And as that, you defer to his opinion. So fatwa shopping and, within Judaism, halakha shopping. I'm not saying that it doesn't happen. Like we said, there's a spectrum of things. What people do and what the religion says could be very, very different things. And so what I'm saying is that it shouldn't happen. Whether it does happen it happens. You said it happens. I mean, I know it happens. I know lots of people that do it. But that doesn't make it, according to the doctrine, right.
Where does authority come in? For example, many people say that the plurality of not having the binding needed allows you to frame the context. So it makes it context specific by not having a binding framework. Are you saying there's a binding framework in both Judaism, Orthodoxism, and Shiism?
Within Shiism, it's more defined than it is in Judaism. In Judaism, it's more open, and it's one day you can choose Rabbi XYZ, tomorrow you can choose Rabbi ABC, but they have to be for different opinions. They can't be for the same opinion. Whereas in Shiism, once you pick mujtahid ABC, decision X, decision D, decision F that come out of his mouth are the decisions that you're bound with until either you or he die. And what happens is that after a mujtahid dies, if you were following him, you are still allowed to follow his rulings until there becomes a case of discrepancy, and then you have to defer to the current mujtahid, which you have to pick, someone that is living that you have to choose. So in the case of Ayatollah Khoui, I mentioned him, although he's been dead for 16 years. People still who were following him at the time he died refer to his opinions, except in the case of discrepancy. And many of the people that I know who do follow Ayatollah Khoui defer to Ayatollah Sistani when it comes to that opinion. However, they can also defer to Ayatollah Fadlullah, Ayatollah Khamenei, or whoever. But their primary decision comes from Ayatollah Khoui, and then to fill any gaps, they use the current marja, the current mujtahid.
One more follow-up comment. That I wanted to say that I think my approach and similar maybe were different, but it seems I would love for someone to tell me why everything I said is wrong, because that would be nice. But I think philosophers and they pretty much never agree on anything. But the consensus against substance dualism is so strong. It's like the earth is not flat, So it's like that's my first priority. So I guess I say then what can we say about religion? Because I guess we're human. We have to go with the best kind of knowledge we have, and that's where I start. So I'd love for someone to give me a good argument against what I said. I'll send you my paper. I haven't sent it yet.
I wanted to comment on the economic aspect of organ transplantation. Othman, you mentioned international treaties or Islamic opinions that says that we should not sell or buy organs. But I think this is a sort of illusion or even a lie compared to the practice, because even the official market, we have an official market and an unofficial market here, and the transplantation lists are an attempt to buy and sell organs without paying the donor and directly, but somebody pays the price. The organ, even in the official market, the organ is treated as a good and has a special value, and the price, for example, the price for a kidney is estimated about 100,000 US dollars, and the distribution in the official market does not function because the organs are distributed are not equally distributed, and that's the reason why we have an unofficial market, and that organs are sold. My point here is that even the official the lists and the official market treats the organ as a good, and this organ has a price, so we cannot say we don't want to sell organs. We do it, and somebody pays the price. Normally, society or the organizations that do the transplant and that control the transplantation, the organ distribution. And I want also to comment on the brain death concept. I think the main difference between brain death and heart death is that if you are unsure if somebody is dead, in the case of heart death, you just wait a little longer to see if he's really dead. But in the case of brain death, you have two doctors who declare a person to be dead, and death occurs at that moment when the physicians declare the person to be dead. And so concerning the point that in an Islamic perspective, death occurs at that moment when the ruh, the spirit leaves the body, this is a tricky question, how to deal with it. Does the spirit leave the body at that moment when the physician declares the person to be dead? I think this is a tricky question. I'm sure you know about this discussion, but you didn't mention it in your talk. Maybe it's present in your paper.
Go ahead. Thank you for raising this. I think that's what the reality what's going on, and this reality unfortunately created human inequality in this that we see in life, and this what they refer to 90-10 gap, where 90% of world resources spent on the health of only 10% of world population. So from spiritual aspect, from Islamic perspective, based on maqasid al-Sharia that I want to share with you, this is wrong, unethical, immoral, un-Islamic, that to have two communities, one entitled because they have the money to get the organs, and one suppressed. They have to sell their money. They have to sell their organs because they don't have the money for their life. So first of all, what I would like to see is based on Maqasid Sharia first, to see equal opportunity for all people regardless of their financial status. That's the first thing. Regardless of their financial status or religion or race, they have equal opportunity to organs. Secondly, then I go to the selling. Should we be compensating or not? This could be debatable. But if the person is selling because of pressure, that he needs the money, this is bad and reflect bad in the whole community, because being poor is not that the person being lazy. Probably there is universal social injustice issue in this area. But then we don't want to. Then it should not be based on the wealth of the person. That only wealthy people can get the organ. That's because it goes along humanity and along the principle of Islam, of equality of all mankind. We cannot have people that they are entitled because of their connection, of their money, of their wealth. If we.
Can we entertain one last question? I'm sorry to interrupt this, but I'd like to get one more question in, and then we have to stop for our break so we can get on to the plenary session.
Omar, you use the word heresy, so I'll continue with it, problematic as that term might be. Some of the comments that you made about the sort of the physiological parameters of brain death maybe not just problematic for Muslims, but for clinicians as well. The American Academy of Neurology, for example, has been struggling with some of these definitions that you brought up for some time, and they're coming up with some new terms, minimally conscious state, and all these other terms that are coming up. I'm just wondering, how did those play a role? And to that point, Dan Brock, whom you may have worked with either at Brown or at Harvard, comments about sort of the difference between having these conversations in the spirit of intellectual discourse as opposed to sort of policy or clinical decision making. And he talks about sort of the concept of justified killing as opposed to withdrawal of life support, and how that didn't fly very well with the Reagan administration when he was working with them. But it was that did okay, within the walls of Harvard and Brown when he was an ethicist there. Just how do you sort of separate the two, especially in such a place that is so controversial and loaded as say the Muslim community and in clinical decision making?
That's really good questions. Well, the first one, I would say that you're absolutely right. There recently was 2003 a consensus statement by the American Academy of Neurology on criteria for brain death, apnea tests, and things like that. But there are patients that pop up all the time that fit certain aspects or parameters, gradations along a scale of conscious to fully unconscious to brain dead, or minimally conscious is also an issue. Some people come out of these things, some people go in and don't come back. So I guess the way I would deal with it was just to think that there's certain things we can't know, and for those as President Bush would say, err on the side of life. didn't mean to piss anyone off. But for the things that are sure, such as criteria that have been established and replicable, such as adequate knowledge of when brainstem function or cortical function is actually gone, those are the most of the things I was thinking about. And because I think those are the basis of an adequate theological rethinking of things. The second point, it's a good point also, because there's a huge expanse between academia and policy world. And, you know, for example, in New York and New Jersey, they have different definitions of death. So you can cross the Hudson River, some people say, and you can be alive, dead. So, but I'd say, you know, it's a tough call, but I think the truth should never be afraid of consequences of itself. It can be misunderstood, but with certain things like this, it seems that, you know, certain things science can't answer, but certain things it can. So things it can, you should definitely make the most out of, you know. Like the idea that we didn't fall from the sky, you know, that's a tough one to deal with. But people are dealing with it, you know. People adequately change their theology. And what are you going to do? You know, that's called part of growing up, isn't it?
Nope. Is the time for one burning? One burning.
All right. Sorry. It's burning. I promise. I promise 6 people.
Yeah, okay. No, just this is a very brief comment. This is on the paper on organ transplants and organ trafficking. I don't have time to go into details, but I have a suggestion. Your title says Islam, organ transplants, and organ trafficking in the Islamic world. I do not understand what Islamic world is. And when you come to trafficking, it's no longer the Islamic world. Trafficking, it's global trafficking, which is the term that is being used by the WHO. And I would suggest that you look at it in global terms. It's not just an Islamic problem.